Well, welcome to today's event. I'm Karen von Hippel, the director at RUSI, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here to an event where we will be discussing the lessons learned from Operation Inherent Resolve, from from trying to defeat ISIS all the way through to how to stabilize the region. And we'll get an update on recent events and discuss lessons learned. On the overall counter-ISIS campaign, we'll be focusing on both the military and the civilian side of the campaign and what comes next. I think all of us know that the ISIS security threat may have slipped from the headlines somewhat, and some politicians may even think that the fight is over. But really, most of us know that it's very much a significant transnational security threat, and it may be with us for years to come. So we're very lucky today to have with us two of the leaders of the counter-ISIS effort, David Schlafer, who is the acting deputy special envoy of the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, based at the State Department, and Major General Kevin Copsy, who is the Deputy Commander for Strategy at the Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve in Iraq. Now, I think most of you know that the Counter-ISIL Coalition was established soon after the so-called Caliphate was declared in Mosul in June 2014. Today, over 80 countries and organizations take part in this coalition, and they use a range of hard and soft power tools. So we will be discussing all of these tools, and we will talk about this threat at the local level as well as the global level, because it is a transnational threat. So this will include what to do about the tens of thousands of foreign fighters and their families who are detained in camps in Syria and Iraq, through to different ways to address the continued metastasizing of this threat. At the global level, I think we've seen some very brutal offshoots recently in Mozambique, and we've also watched the organization and network grow online, trying to establish some sort of virtual caliphate. So it's a multidimensional challenge, and it's being addressed in a multidimensional manner. Now, fortunately, we're very lucky to have two speakers who can address this threat from a range of perspectives. And really are here to help us understand how the threat has evolved. Let me just briefly introduce the two speakers, and then I will turn it over to each of them. David Schlafer has been the acting deputy special envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS since September 2020. Before that, he was the director of the Global Coalition's executive secretariat called SECI, and he is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service. He has served in Romania, Japan, Iraq, Finland, Mexico, and Brazil, all coalition members as far as I know, and has had several assignments at the State Department in Washington, D.C. Major General Kevin Copsy has been the Deputy Commander for Strategy at CJ, Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve, since last summer as well. And he was commissioned into the Royal Engineers in April 1990. He has served in Germany, Canada, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and now Iraq. He's also held several senior positions at NATO's UK-based headquarters, the Allied Rapid Reaction Corps, which is also called the ARC. And before his current position, he was the British Army's head of future force development, which is really responsible for delivering a new Army operation concept, driving interoperability, innovation, and focusing on research and experimentation. In 1 month, he will be leaving Iraq, and he will become chief of staff back at the ARC in the UK. So what I'm going to do for the next hour is I will first ask our two speakers to provide some introductory remarks. Then I'm going to ask a few questions to each of them, and then I'll take questions from the audience. If you have any questions, you all know the drill. Put them in the chat section of the Zoom page, and I will get to them. And all of this, the entire event today is on the record, okay? So let's start out with David. David, why don't you provide sort of an introductory, some introductory remarks to where we are and the challenge?
Great. Pleased to do so, and thank you so much, Karen. And it's nice to see you, Kevin, and to everybody at RUSI for hosting the event today. Again, I'm David Schlafer. I am the acting Deputy Special Envoy to the Global Coalition here at the State Department, and I work very closely with what we call our Coalition Secretariat, the office here at the State Department that is loosely in charge of coordinating and collaborating and working with all of the different members, the 83 members, the member states, and the international organizations that comprise the global coalition. We've got a really strong office. It's a fantastic place to work. It's been very rewarding for me personally. One of the most interesting things and one of the, I think, most significant things about the Global Coalition Office at the State Department is that it is a multilateral office, one of the largest multilateral offices that there is at the State Department. We have foreign diplomats who are detailed or seconded from various coalition countries here working with us. At the moment, we have a senior Australian diplomat. We have diplomats who are subject matter experts in different lines of effort as regards our counter-terrorist activities from Belgium and from Spain who are working with us right now. And in the very recent past, we've had colleagues from Italy. We've had colleagues from Germany. We will continue to engage in this type of a multilateral effort going forward. And I think it really shows one of the strengths of the global coalition, that it has been able to come together like this. The cohesion is absolutely excellent and outstanding. There is absolutely no sign or indication that that is going to change. And we are absolutely committed going forward to maintaining this really strong international / multilateral effort. And I wanted to cite that at the very outset because I wanted to lead off my short remarks today with a quote from President Biden that he made just a couple of weeks after he was inaugurated on January 20th. It was his first major foreign policy speech. And again, he was talking about this concept of multilateralism that I just referred to, that is such a big part of the global coalition. And in this speech, and I will quote, he said, "America's alliances are our greatest asset, and leading with diplomacy means standing shoulder to shoulder with our allies and with our key partners once again." And so I think, and we think here at the Global Coalition, that this is a prime example of the type of multilateral approach, that we are a prime example of that type of multilateral approach that is at the center of the Biden administration's foreign policy writ large, and certainly its policy toward continuing to work toward the enduring defeat of ISIS. I'll do a couple of things in these opening remarks, and then I'll turn it over to Kevin. I want to talk a little bit about the global coalition in general. We have 83 members now, as I just mentioned. 78 of those are member states, and there are 5 international organizations. It is a growing coalition. Since 2017, we have actually welcomed 13 new members from Africa and Asia as we continue to expand our interest and our work in the global space and in the international space in order to counter where ISIS is becoming active. We're very clear that ISIS, although significantly degraded, remains a significant challenge, but relentless pressure by our security partners in Iraq and Syria, and global coalition support writ large, particularly stabilization support, is thwarting the ISIS insurgency. I always like to say, you know, around this time when I'm giving remarks about the coalition, we talk about the fact that ISIS is significantly degraded and is, you know, a shadow perhaps of its former self a few years ago. That may be the case. However, over the course of the last 2 decades almost, we have encountered violent extremist threats in this region, in Iraq, in Syria, in the Middle East, in the world writ large repeatedly. And we have seen coalitions come together, and we have seen when these coalitions are victorious, when these coalitions have achieved a significant measure of success, a certain pulling back, a certain retrenching. There is a fatigue factor that sets in. I don't want to say there's a complacency, because I think that's overstating it, and it's not very charitable or generous to the countries involved. But we have seen a certain disengagement at a certain point of success. And we know what that story is. We know where that story leads. We know what happens next. As soon as you have that type of disengagement, a vacuum forms, and you have maleficent actors who fill that vacuum. ISIS being the most recent iteration, and the iteration that we are focused upon and that we are combating now. So the coalition takes that very seriously. The member states take that very seriously, and we are committed to not repeating those mistakes of history at this stage in the ongoing campaign by becoming complacent, by disengaging to some extent, or withdrawing or pulling back, and not continuing to focus as relentlessly as we have been focusing on ISIS and on the problem in the core in Iraq and Syria, and also globally. I'll cite a few things that the coalition is doing right now in different lines of effort. I'll talk a little bit about Iraq and Syria specifically, and then a little bit about the global piece. The coalition is engaged in quite a few lines of effort right now. One of the most important of these is the active disruption of ISIS's financial efforts globally, including measures coordinated by the global coalition's counter-ISIS or counter-Daesh finance group. The U.S. government, for example, has recently issued a $5 million reward for information related to ISIS's exploitation of oil and antiquities through the State Department's Rewards for Justice program. Another line of effort that we're actively engaged in is strategic communications. While Daesh's ability to produce the type of propaganda or the scale of propaganda that it did a couple of years ago has definitely been diminished and degraded, it is reliant upon propaganda to connect with its support base, and it continues to issue violent content, calls for violence, information propaganda that it believes will allow it to attract recruits from vulnerable populations. This information is disseminated via encrypted platforms. It remains incumbent upon the tech industry, upon the coalition, the intelligence community, partner states, etc., to collaborate and to work together to prevent terrorist exploitation of their platforms. I can mention in this context, not only are we concerned about ISIS as an organization that is established in Iraq and in Syria, ISIS as an inspiration for networks and affiliates that are working in Africa, but of course we're also very concerned about the lone wolf type of dynamic. The United States and quite a few other countries have been impacted by this over the course of the past 3, 4, 5 years. We see individuals who don't have any explicit ties or connections to ISIS who in effect self-radicalize by ingesting the propaganda and the material that ISIS disseminates both openly on the internet and on the web, and also through some of these encrypted sources. Just this morning, I read another article about this incident that happened in the United States about a week and a half ago, where there was a shooting in Boulder, Colorado. The young man involved is believed to have had some type of connection with an individual that the FBI in the United States was apparently tracking and was apparently concerned about. The investigation is still at an early stage, but this is about the third or fourth I've read that suggested there could be that kind of dynamic, at least partially in play, where the individual who committed the shootings may have been exposed to this type of material online. Maybe that was a factor in this most recent incident. Whether or not it still reminds us that all of our societies are extremely vulnerable to this type of dynamic, and we know the type of pain and the type of suffering even a single individual who does self-radicalize and then acts upon it after being exposed to this type of ISIS propaganda, how much pain and how much suffering can come as a result of that. Let me turn quickly to Iraq and Syria. Very quickly in Iraq, we've had a tremendous amount of success working with our partner forces. I think Kevin will address that after I stop speaking, in order to, in the kinetic campaign and the military campaign, the security campaign, continue to degrade and defeat ISIS and to build up the capabilities of our partner forces so that they are able to take on that mission themselves. What the civilian side of the coalition has done is to work to revive liberated communities, and that work continues in Iraq. To give you a concrete example, a UNESCO development initiative to revive the spirit of Mosul, one of the cities that was the most impacted and most affected by the fighting, through a UAE-funded survey, has assessed how residents would like to see the Al-Nuri Mosque rebuilt and other significant parts of the city rebuilt. We just saw in March of 2021 the visit of the Pope to this city, to Mosul, really bringing the attention of the world to what is going on there. The Pope spoke about the fraternity and the fellowship between people of all faiths. And he said that hope could never be, and this is another quote I wanted to leave with you, silenced by the blood spilled by those who pervert the name of God to pursue paths of destruction. Turning quickly to Syria, the security situation in northeast Syria continues to endanger humanitarian efforts in that area. And we're very concerned about the conditions for thousands of individuals and displaced peoples in camps throughout northeast Syria. Humanitarian aid and stabilization assistance writ large continues to be delivered. Despite that, however, in very large quantities throughout the camps, with the largest population obviously in the camp in Al-Hol. We are aware of reports, obviously, that ISIS terrorists are taking advantage or attempting to take advantage of instability in the camps in northeastern Syria to escape the camps that our local partner forces are guarding right now, and we continue to evaluate that situation very closely. And it is a very serious situation. We have had, since the beginning of 2021, I don't have the number in front of me right now, but I believe it's something along the lines of 27 individuals who have been murdered in Al-Hol, presumably at the behest of an ISIS network that has attempted to establish itself within the camp in order to exercise discipline, in order to radicalize children in particular who are in the camps in ISIS ideology. This is a significant concern, and it really points to the need and the urgent need to continue to work towards solutions for the population that is in the camps. The situation is untenable in the long term. More economic and stabilization assistance and development is needed in order to allow individuals to leave camps and return to their homes in Iraq and in Syria. The repatriation dynamic, and I think we'll probably talk about that more in just a little bit, is extremely important with the population of what we call foreign terrorist fighters. These are fighters or their family members, wives, children in large numbers who are associated with these individuals, who are nationals not of Iraq or Syria, but of other countries, lots of European nationals. There have been American nationals, United States nationals, who have been repatriated. And the ultimate fate of these individuals, the need to move this population out of this unstable and untenable situation, and to resolve the issues that have arisen as a result. A big part of what the coalition is trying to do, and a very difficult issue that it's hard to achieve consensus on within the coalition, given the complexities involved. Moving on very quickly to the global threat, Karen mentioned what has taken place recently in Mozambique. I think all of us, if we follow what's going on with ISIS and Daesh, if we follow what's going on in Africa, are aware of almost the daily reports coming out of Mozambique now of attacks and atrocities that are committed by ISIS-affiliated or inspired terrorists. That same dynamic is taking place in other parts of Africa, most importantly or significantly probably in West Africa and in the Sahel. What the coalition is doing right now, although traditionally we have been focused obviously on Iraq and Syria, is beginning to expand beyond that core region and beginning to look at what the coalition can do, particularly I think in the area of strategic communications and perhaps counter ISIS financing in the Africa space, coordinating and collaborating with other coalitions, other alliances, with other members, with other countries, etc., who are active in the same space. Finally, I'll conclude by mentioning some of the meetings and gatherings that the coalition is engaged in. And it's incredible that we've been able throughout the course of the past 14, 15 months during the global pandemic to continue to continue the pace and the frequency of coalition engagements, including very senior engagements. The most recent of these was just a few days ago on March the 30th, when Secretary of State Blinken and the Belgian Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Sophie Wilmes co-hosted a ministerial meeting of about 30 foreign ministers of key coalition member states. It was the first time in quite a few months that this grouping at that level had come together in order to reflect upon the challenges that we face in 2021, in particular to talk about stabilization assistance needs and requirements and to chart a way forward. And we anticipate and we hope that with the global COVID situation changing, we are going to be able to meet in person the entire coalition at the ministerial level in the summer of 2021 this year in Italy. This brings together almost 80 foreign ministers. It is the single largest gathering of foreign ministers outside of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. A very, very significant event. And we're going to keep our fingers crossed that the COVID situation allows it and that we do see some light at the end of the tunnel there. I'll stop there. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kevin, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have after his presentation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, David. Over to you, General Kevin.
Thank you very much, Karen, David, and hello, good afternoon or good morning to wherever you are down into this really good session. What I want to do is just build on what David spoke about and just give a bit of a flavour for some of the challenges that we're facing out here in Iraq. I'm speaking to you from Baghdad, where the Combined Joint Task Force headquarters is actually based, and as I look back in the rearview mirror, I think that we are on the back end of what has been a really successful military campaign. The international coalition, 76 nations, 5 different international organizations collaborating together to deliver a military force which has 27 nations providing military capability to get after the enduring defeat of Daesh, and over a number of years working alongside the Iraqis, the Peshmerga up in the north in Kurdistan, and the Syria Democratic Force. I think that we've now well and truly defeated Daesh. Now, we may have dismantled them territorially. We've dismantled over 110,000 square kilometers, liberated nearly 8 million Iraqis or Kurds or Syrian Kurds from northeast Syria. But whereas we have defeated Daesh today, we've still got some way to deny Daesh tomorrow. And that's some of the sources of instability that David was talking about, that I'll talk about what inherent resolve and the part that we play, both as a convening power, but also to leverage our influence and our presence out here in theatre. But what I think's the most interesting part of this particular operation is it started off as a series of state actors using industrial war means against a sub-state actor, that being ISIS when it had its caliphate. Now that we're in the final chapter of the campaign, we are now facing not just Daesh as the threat, but also power competition from numerous sovereign states that are competing and contesting both culture, economics, and security across the Levant, and in particular in Iraq. We also have a number of violent extreme militia groups that target the coalition and be a distraction against our mission of supporting the Iraqi security forces in getting after the defeat of ISIS, and the political elites as well, that wherever they are on the political spectrum, is that they can be the spoilers or accelerants to a level of stability out here. And collectively, that produces a very uncertain environment that can often be volatile. We often get rocket attacks here aimed at both the base and where we sit alongside the US Embassy. And that volatility and operating sub-threshold in a way in which we don't punch above any red lines of any nation state or any proxy for miscalculation and escalation of violence, and something that I'll talk about that happened over certainly December into January. It requires a different style of coalition leadership, the one that we have here at the moment, a more nuanced use of the military lever, and the way in which we collaborate and coordinate with United Action Partners, those non-military partners that, again, I'll speak about, to try and achieve a unity of effort, if not a unity of command. And what I would contest is that how Operation Inherent Resolve is operating out here now, which is embracing all domains, the traditional land, sea, air, but also the new novel ones of space and cyber, will be the way in which the military, working in coalitions alongside and through proxies, will be how we will operate on any operation around the world. And that's why I think that the lessons that we are learning from this operation, I think, will be a real signpost to how we will operate again in the future. Just a little bit on the threat, again, building on David. So ISIS, territorially defeated. However, they do operate within 3 geographical areas and 1 conceptual temporal one. The 3 geographical areas in Iraq, we have the inhospitable terrain of the Makmurn, the Hamrin Mountains, and it's a gap on the Kurdish coordination line where neither the federal government forces in the south or the Peshmerga in the north will go and try and occupy. It's in the disputed territories. Daesh know that. They operate from bed down locations in caves, and we've just done quite a protracted operation alongside the Iraqis to destroy a lot of those bed down locations and to remove a lot of Daesh fighters from that. Because from there they export their violence down into places like Baghdad, where at the end of January we had some suicide bombers, which was the thing that attracted the international media over that period of time. Looking elsewhere, the middle Euphrates River Valley, from where the Euphrates crosses into the Iraqi country, all the way up northwest to Deir ez-Zor, is a complex matrix of actors, all of them competing against each other. We have competitive tribes, we have Lebanese Hezbollah, we've got militia groups, we've got the Assad regime, and we've got them sponsored by obviously the Russians. And indeed, on the eastern part of the Euphrates, we've got coalition forces as well. And that creates fissures. And those fissures and those seams are where Daesh, if we are not careful, will emerge in a new sort of violent strategy. And they export their violence from the Badia Desert, which is outside of where the coalition operates, and certainly where the Assad regime and the Russian forces operate. And it's for them to deal with some of the bed down locations and training sites for them. The conceptual threat of ISIS is where we seek to try and deny them tomorrow. And David's understandably spoken about Al-Hol, 65,000 in there, 30,000 of them Iraqis. And we spend a lot of time, certainly in my role, in trying to be a coherent factor with the Iraqis to take on their responsibilities of removing a lot of those internally displaced people and reintegrating them and repatriating them back into greater Iraq. And indeed, detainee detention sites as well is where appropriately is trying to give the tools needed and the skills by the Syrian Democratic Forces, who do an admirable job of looking after and controlling the detainee sites and helping administer Al-Hol and Al-Roj as well. So we do quite a lot of work there. There has been a lot of attraction to US numbers out here in Iraq. Prior to December, you would have seen that there's been reductions. I think we've witnessed healthy reductions as the campaign continues to evolve, from originally 9,500 US, now down to declared 2,500. And that's pretty much mirrored with the coalition force as well, non-US, of the other 26 partner nations. What we did see is that the COVID pandemic, from a bizarre standpoint, was one of the best catalysts for evolving the campaign for all the right reasons. Many nations took their troops back because of the COVID problems and social distancing. And it was like a child riding a bike with stabilizers. The stabilizers were off, and the Iraqi security forces saw that they were actually better than they thought they were, and that they could actually take the fight to ISIS. And this was after the fall of Baghouz. And what we see now is the coalition starting to recalibrate and reorientate itself to a new delivery of the counter-ISIS fight. Whereas before, training at the tactical level to watch the Iraqis then going to the fight or Peshmerga, now with the lack of troops, we've reorientated to advisors, almost like a management consultancy that's embedded within the operational level of practitioners within the Iraqi security forces, and advising them on how to maintain a tempo, how to exploit intelligence forensics, and how to get after the correct use of discrete strike capabilities, be it through artillery or through air power. And we continue to grow their air power accordingly. So the reduction in US forces in particular, but also broadly caused by COVID, did actually allow this opportunity and a value proposition to be put to the government of Iraq, in that we have got the sort of length and breadth of combat troops, and we're now in this advisory mission. And we do this for one reason, and that is to protect the future. We don't see Operation Inherent Resolve as military doctrine would suggest, as terminating as such, but more transitioning into an Iraq that enjoys bilateral security cooperation with many different nations, just as part of the usual routine international relations that any country enjoys. And so we are starting to set the conditions for that, and we try to operate through a calibrated presence, posture and profile, so as not to actually incite an implementation of the Council of Representatives decision that was to remove all foreign forces last January. So far we've been successful, but I know that we will face challenging times as we go towards the Iraqi election in October. But the way in which we operate, the value proposition, the advising, and the defeat of Daesh mission as our single sole mandate should be enough to allow the government of Iraq, irrespective of who holds the Prime Minister's chair, to see value in having a foreign engagement. And that's alongside the NATO mission Iraq that's doing institutional reform at the Ministry of Defence level. And they're growing now in their capability and in their reputation, and they will seed forth quite a lot of institutional reform that the Iraqis will benefit from in years to come. And the NATO mission Iraq is just one other united action partner that we work with. We work alongside international organizations and NGOs, particularly in that northeast Syria piece, where there is a security challenge, but also a stabilization humanitarian one as well. And because we spread across the Levant, and we do have a healthy Rolodex and working alongside the ambassadors, the special envoys, the NGOs who are based out of either Beirut or down in Amman in Jordan, is collectively to give them the broad context of security, but also a sense of timing. That if areas like Al-Hol and the detainee problems are not unlocked within certainly the next 2 years or so, that you could actually see that the seeds of a new form of Daesh, a new form of violent extremist organization that will grow from it. And if that is not addressed, then unfortunately we will be back here in years to come doing a similar mission. But of course, all this is one part of our operating environment out here, and it has a shadow that is cast by the actions of the militia groups that do target the coalition. We have rocket attacks regularly within Baghdad, within some of the other coalition bases from these. These were originally Popular Mobilization Front forces that have then fragmented away in their own self-interest, Al-Haq and Katib Hezbollah, just to name two, and they do try and attack us and target our convoys. But when they do attack us, quite often the rockets overshoot our bases, and they're the ones that actually kill, maim and damage the infrastructure of the Iraqi people that they say they are here to protect. We have the ability to defend ourselves against them, but most importantly, because of reduction in numbers, actually it's the Iraqi security forces that admirably look after our own security and guard our convoys that unfortunately are still being targeted relatively frequently. But that said, the convoys that come up from Kuwait are actually bringing equipment and kit and arms for the Iraqi security forces to deliver a stable environment for the Iraqi people. So yet again, undermining the very narrative that the militia groups do seed. So all in all, very complex environment, very challenging, reflective, I think, of operation environments wherever we may see ourselves around the globe. And we are now on a trajectory where we set up this value proposition of advisory to make sure the Iraqi security forces can develop a sense of resilience, not just to get after Daesh, but also good enough to deal with any security threat internally that it may face in the future. And I'll conclude there, Karen, and hand the floor back to you.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you both. Really excellent remarks and introduction to the challenge set, which is just so complicated, and it gets more and more complicated every year in many different ways. Let me start out with David, because General Kevin was discussing or is talking about how on the military side they are trying to transition to more of a bilateral, normal sense where there'll be fewer coalition troops and it'll be more support on a bilateral basis. In terms of the coalition itself, what is the long-term plan? I know it will change all the time, but I know it'll be an end state versus an end date. But what is the plan at the moment for the coalition?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Certainly, I think that the coalition isn't going anywhere. So the plan is for us to, continue to operate really on all four or all five cylinders. Those cylinders being the working groups that we have. The coalition operates largely through 5 working groups. One of them is a political military affairs working group. So that's working with Kevin, that's working with CGTF and OIR, and with the security or the military or the kinetic, element. And then on the civilian side, my team is primarily working on the foreign terrorist fighter issue. We work on strategic communications through our communications working group. We work on counter ISIS financing, and we work in the stabilization space. And so I think the future, the near or immediate future, is continued activity in both Iraq and in Syria on those lines of effort. And again, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we're really starting a conversation right now about ISIS Global. And that's both in Africa and Asia, but the focus is on Africa right now, on Mozambique, on West Africa and the Sahel, looking at what we've done and what we're doing right now in the core, and trying to figure out how some of those capabilities, expertise, national and coalition expertise that we have gained over the years could be profitably employed in the fight against ISIS in Africa. I think for 2021, however, the primary area of focus that we're looking at is going to remain in Iraq and Syria, the stabilization space. So, for example, we just decided what our stabilization assistance requirements and targets are going to be as a coalition for 2021. We're looking at about $750 million, split more or less roughly between Iraq and between northeastern Syria. This is for stabilization writ large, so everything from infrastructure to water projects to education projects. This is assistance that would be delivered inside northeast Syria in Al-Hol and in IDP camps. It contains assistance for detentions and helping local partners. It would be delivered in a variety of ways. Some of it would go through the UNDP, let's say, in Iraq. Some of it might be delivered through an organization like UNITAD or UNESCO. Some of it would be delivered by NGOs and other type of implementers. And there is direct delivery of some assistance from governments, from the United States, from other coalition members to certain projects or to certain communities as well. It's really a patchwork of different things. And it's one of the things that we do here at the Coalition Office to try to play that foreign assistance matchmaking type of dynamic, working with CGTF, OIR, and others in the field, determining what needs are, finding projects that meet those needs, and then coordinating and collaborating among the member states to come up with the necessary funding in order to carry through and actually deliver some dollars to those projects.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you for that. It sounds like you're not quite ready to have those discussions about transitioning to a different model, that you're trying to get the job done in Iraq and Syria first, but also trying to expand the focus on the global threat as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we do in Africa is going to look very different from what we did in Iraq and Syria. Obviously, the threat is different. Very different dynamic. It's different in every member state. The networks and affiliates, as we refer to them, are different than ISIS in the core. You're not going to be seeing some huge, military mission with a coalition flag moving into Africa. When we talk about stabilization and foreign assistance, it might look very different. On the other hand, I think that there are things that we do in the communication space with strategic communications that we're doing right now that are very replicable in Africa, and that we could probably ramp up and begin relatively quickly, and much sooner. And so there's a good example of a line of effort that we might be able to more or less seamlessly move into the Africa space and adapt for the type of ISIS that we're facing there. So a little bit of a difference, but I think one of the advantages of the coalition that we've always had in every line of effort is the flexibility and the soft bones, so to speak, of the coalition. Different member states that are concerned about different things or who have capability or expertise in different lines of effort coming together under that coalition umbrella and then applying their collective expertise to the problem.
Yep, no, that all makes sense, although it makes your job a lot more difficult because there's a lot to coordinate. So Kevin, let me ask you a bit about, you talked about the Al Hol camp, and there are a few other detention centers. We know that a lot of countries, in particular in Europe, are slightly still playing that ostrich role. They don't want these people to come back home, and they're basically putting their head in the sands and not addressing it in a way that I think many of us feel they need to. There's a concern about, some of these people escaping even. Are your forces out there involved at all in even advising the Kurds who are holding them in these camps about security? What kind of a role do you play there?
So the biggest areas that where the IDP camps and the detainee sites are actually in northeast Syria. We have prisons such as Hasaka, which is the largest, has 6,000 detainees. Al Hol, 65,000 IDPs or so. We don't actually get involved in any of those locations. What we do is to try and give the skills, the tradecraft needed for the Syrian Democratic Forces who admirably look after these locations to actually do it themselves. So with the detention centers, it's how to actually control them in a safety way in which it's compliant with international standards. And then with Al Hol, it's just making sure it's a secure environment that the SEF can create to allow the NGOs to operate within it. And it is a challenge from a coalition that has many diverse nations with different national policy perspectives. But we do recognize that there needs to be international durable solutions to address both the detention problem and also Al Hol. Where I first a lot of my time is, irrespective of where those occupants come from, is very much in the Iraqi space, is to get the 30,000 serf from Al Hol to be repatriated back into Iraq and then to a reintegration program, and those detainees back as well into Iraq, into a judicial pathway from which they would go to prison sentence or whatever. And any ones that require de-radicalization programs, that the right international organization is actually in the lead delivering them. And I just find myself trying to be a convening power to actually being the problem and the organization that can provide the solution together.
Story of our lives. We are on mute too often in this virtual world we all live in. Let me start to take a few questions because we only have about 15 more minutes. And I'll go through a few, and I apologize to the participants that we're not going to get through all of them. But there's a first question from Alfie Cherry, really about Turkish opposition to support for the SDF. And maybe we can expand that a bit just to talk a little bit with both of you about the role of the regional actors. I know you both mentioned some of the challenges related to the regional actors, whether it's Turkey or Iran or some of the Gulf countries or Israel, really getting involved in various ways, and the challenges in coordinating all that. Maybe, General Kevin, I'll start with you on that. Just hear your thoughts.
So we look at certainly a lot of the state actors within northeast Syria through the optics of the Syrian Democratic Forces. So I just described how we help them to get after containing the detention sites and Al-Hol, but they're also fighting ISIS, in particular down at the river valley. But they do have distractions as well. They do feel to a certain extent that that there is an existential threat to their existence. So when you have the Turkish-supported organizations in the north, or it be it the Turkish forces that are operating along the border area, or indeed the Russians as well, is that there's a distraction for them. And my fear is that they could actually redeploy their forces away from what I perceive as being the next threat, the detention sites in Al-Hol, to actually face those others would be unhelpful for everybody. We do work alongside the Russians. We deconflict with them. We don't coordinate with them. We only deconflict in time and space, because it's a very congested area in northeast Syria with many different actors, and the opportunity to unfortunately miscalculate is always there. There has been one miscalculation back in September that caused some injuries to some US servicemen, and actually since then, thankfully, there's been nothing since then. And whenever there are infringements, there's proper representation. Where I sense there is a greater challenge is within Iraq, is the Kurds, and how Erbil and the Kurdish regional government deal with the PKK problem they have in the northwestern part of their province, and the Turkish operations that they use to actually go down. The most recent being the Gara Mountains and a series of air assault operations, where effectively you've got Turkey coming into other sovereign airspace. But that's obviously one for the government of Baghdad, and in particular Erbil, to try and tease out. I'll then hand over to David, see if he's got any thought.
Well, David, I mean, most of these countries I mentioned, not all of them, though, are members of the coalition as well. So it kind of goes back to what we talked about at the end of your last comments about some of your internal challenges, trying to manage the frictions between some of the regional powers.
Yeah, it's always a very complicated diplomatic dance. I think that the coalition has done a masterful job of engaging in that type of diplomacy. But we're able to do that because of that strong shared commitment that every single member state has to the defeat of ISIS. So that is the overwhelming goal that allows us to overcome some of the challenges that we have of different member states, viewing certain issues like this issue, the issue we're talking about, local partner forces or whatever, through a different lens, and being able to achieve a modus vivendi or a modus operandi that has allowed us to be successful against ISIS, even in the face of the recognition that there is ultimately going to be national differences of opinion on certain issues.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me now, there's a couple questions about NATO, the NATO mission. And I guess the question is, how effective really do you think it is? Is it, how do you distinguish between what the NATO troop, I know you talked about it a bit earlier, Kevin, but is there a longer term transition being planned in addition to the bilateral support you talked about?
Yes, so we provide operational level advising to the headquarters that's involved in executing operations against Daesh across the country and into Syria. What's become quite clear is, although they have the operational tempo and the planning capability, what they need is institutional reform in how to do financial planning, how to generate their forces, how to have a career stream for their soldiers and officers, how to have greater diversity, how to challenge a corruption culture within the Ministry of Defence and indeed other institutions as well. So this is where NATO has an important role to play. So they sit very much up at the higher strategic level within the Ministry of Defence, trying to get them to understand the policies and the programs that they need to adopt to create a military that can be properly manned, trained and equipped to do both training and operations in the future. We have an army at the moment that has never seen peace since 2003 and has not got used to actually what a peacetime military should look like, or indeed how it should be created from a structural perspective. So hopefully NATO Mission Iraq will be able to sow those seeds, but it's up for the Iraqis to adopt that reform and then implement it in the years to come.
Okay, great. And David, a question for you from you and Grant, is one of our members, really about all these labels of terrorist groups, whether it's ISIS or Al Qaeda or these offshoots. He's wondering if it's helpful when many of the groups are indigenous, and often, I think, as we've seen over the years, many of these guys change hats. So they're maybe Nusra one day, but then they're ISIL another day, depending on who's helping to pay the bills, etc. So can you talk a bit about that fluidity in labeling?
Yeah, I could take a quick stab at that, and I think that it's a great question. I agree with the the analysis behind that question. It's difficult to apply labels in the Africa space, I think, in particular, because you are talking about affiliates, networks, etc., that may have multiple inspirations, that may brand themselves as one thing one day or in one operation and something very different in another. That is part of the fluidity that characterizes the dynamic there. It's one of the things that I mentioned a few minutes ago when I said that what the coalition is going to do in Africa probably will look very differently than what it did in Iraq and in Syria. And the main reason for that is because the threat is very different and the nature of the threat, and it gets to this question of identity. Having said that, I think at the same time, what we are trying to do and what the coalition hopes to bring to the table are very practical solutions. And those solutions are going to be applicable in the context of or irrespective of this type of fluidity, even in the realm of strategic communications, where maybe the identity label, let's say, and the identity issue becomes extremely important. And how do you craft counter messaging? What do you actually do in order to counter propaganda writ large when that propaganda looks very, very different than it did in Iraq and in Syria? It's a challenge, but we have developed some extremely sophisticated and increasingly sophisticated modes and vehicles, I think, for dealing with that complicated dynamic. And indeed, we're very eager to get involved in that space. So yes, all of that is true. Yes, it is a challenge, but we think that that's a challenge that can be overcome. And it certainly doesn't mean that the coalition should not just, get involved and should stay out of that space simply because it's a different dynamic with its own set, its own problem set.
Okay, great, thank you. General Kevin, this is a question from Jillian Dare, although I don't know what organization she works for, but she says, our partners in northern Iraq, especially from the ethno-religious minorities, report that various militias, especially those controlled by Iran and Turkey, are forcibly recruiting underage boys and getting young men to join them voluntarily because there's no other opportunities for them. Is the coalition or OIR working on ways of preventing that from happening?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it unfortunately reflects quite a lot of the threats across broader Iraq, which is addressing the sources of instability to try and stop a future ISIS from emanating. And certainly what she's just described there is what is clearly evident, is that militia groups, or indeed any other organization, are actually going to target the youth. And it's the youth that are feeling disenfranchised because of the economic challenges that Iraq faces. So we within the coalition, military coalition, have no part to play, but the UN Development Programme and other parts of UNAMI actually have youth projects to try and change the narrative to such a way that actually that they don't get seduced by going across and joining such militia groups. But what we do is to try and make certainly the Iraqi security forces, or indeed the Peshmerga in the north, aware of the challenges also that they face as well, to make sure that when they're out on the patrols doing framework patrolling, things like that, that it's a case of actually just trying to literally wrap your arms around the youth, just to try and pull them away from that malign influence.
Okay, thank you for that. And there's a related question for both of you really to answer, because there's obviously a military and a civilian aspect to the PMF militias from Ina Rudolph. What do you see as a future for these previously mentioned PMFs, or popular mobilization units, especially along the Iraqi-Syrian border? This has been an ongoing challenge for some time, about demobilizing. Can you talk a bit about that challenge, and then I'll go to General Kevin, and then I'll go to David.
So the Popular Mobilization Force, as many people dialing in would know, was created in order to try and get after the ISIS. And they did an amazing job alongside the Iraqi conventional forces in doing that defeat. But of course, what's happened now is that you've got this fighting force that is extremely large. It increases the size of the public sector that can't be paid for, resourced properly by the government of Iraq. And certainly we, the coalition, don't actually support the PMF in the way in which we do the counterterrorism service or the Iraqi security apparatus. And because of their size, they're becoming unmanageable. And what needs to happen within Baghdad is a decision at the political level as to what is to actually be done with them. Are they to be demobilized? Are they to be re-rolled? The positioning of them, so on and so forth. Whilst they are out in the environment, they are a complicating factor. They are more so actually towards the Kurds in the north than they are actually against the Syrian border. With the Kurds in the north, there is real distrust between the two organizations, the Peshmerga and the PMF. And because of it, it then creates a scene. Goes back to the Makmur Mountains, to the Hamrin Mountains, is from that scene, ISIS will emanate. So wherever you have these actors in conflict with each other, you end up with a fissure that will be exploited. And it needs to be a very tough decision at political leadership in how they're dealt with. The PMF is one thing, it's the fracturing of those other elements, the Kataib Hezbollah, the Al-Haq, that become the bigger problem that, again, Iraq needs to address because it's an Iraq domestic challenge.
Yeah. All right, David, let me ask you actually a different question about Mosul and the rebuilding of Mosul, because that's been such an enormous challenge. How can you give us a bit of an update about that, the stabilization, not really the humanitarian aspects of it, but more the stabilization aspects?
Yeah, I can tell you really briefly that that's one of the greatest challenges, and ongoing challenges that I think there is in the Iraq space. The coalition has played a role along with other international donors and elements in funneling tens of millions of dollars into Mosul for a variety of different projects. And that was a city that was just so absolutely devastated, and a population that was so traumatized that you're talking about basic humanitarian needs for everything, for basic infrastructure, to have access to water, to have access to adequate food supply sources, to begin to rebuild from the bottom up, physical infrastructure to then support education, to then support the basic healthcare structures, to allow individuals and residents who had largely fled the city to begin to come back. Now, there are good signs there. There are good news stories. More and more of the population has returned. Probably every couple of months there'll be, a de facto ribbon cutting. I'm using that as just an offhand colloquial phrase, but in other words, something that is back online, an electrical sub-generation plant or something that is now working that wasn't working previously. So there are some very positive signs there, but the people of that area still have a long way to go, I think, before anything resembling the life that they had before. And there were challenges before ISIS took Mosul, obviously, before anything resembling their former life is that they're able to return to that.
Thank you for that. I think, unfortunately, we're running out of time, so let me just have one last question to both of you, which kind of touches on the future. And it's Francis Tamer, who recently retired from the Ministry of Defense in the UK, really asking about, that great big sucking sound. The attention is shifting over to Indo-Pacific, great powers, Russia, China, and away in many ways from the Middle East region. How do we ensure, as David mentioned at the start, that we can keep attention on this, that this job is done in a proper way with the right type of focus on the civilian and the military sides of it? Maybe I'll start with you, General Kevin.
Thank you very much. Well, I think what has become apparent is, certainly within the 27 nations that provide military capabilities here, that there is still a very strong commitment to stay here. We see that there is still work to do with the Iraqi security forces. We spoke about end state a little later on. I think that the way in which we write our military pamphlets that tell us how to have these military campaigns would suggest that an end state means that it all ends. I don't think it ever does. It's a continuum of military engagement within the region and within the country that you will see. So there will always be a reason to be here in order to create a durable level of stability that is sustainable and legitimate. as we do with any other part of the globe. So I think there is still a strong commitment to be here. I think we've learned a lot of lessons in the past, in previous conflicts where we've left prematurely. It creates a security vacuum and something emerges as a result. So we enjoy a good relationship with the government of Iraq at the moment. The nature of that will change. The nature of the military involvement here will change. But collaboratively, that will deny the oxygen of any extremist organization to emanate from it. And I think there's a realization that, yes, there may be a focus on Indo-Pacific, but there is still a need to have something in the relative near abroad, particularly to the likes of Europe.
Great. Well, thank you for that. David, any last thoughts on enduring?
And I'll just, that was a great answer by Kevin, and I'll just very quickly elaborate on that too. Certainly coalition commitment remains very, very strong. We see that across all of our member states. And that's really driven by a recognition of the consequences of what could happen and what might happen if we disengage, as the international community has disengaged in the past. The Middle Eastern partners, whether it's the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Emiratis, the Egyptians, whomever, they're well aware of the destabilizing consequences for that region if things do not go well in Iraq and Syria. We have so many partners in Europe. They are well aware of the destabilizing consequences of things like the 2015 large-scale migration flow into Europe, of terrorist attacks in Europe, both ISIS directed or the lone wolf dynamic. So I think that the national interests and the regional interests of the coalition partners, among those, there's a definite recognition that the challenge, the fight, the campaign, whatever, is evolving and will continue to evolve, as Kevin cited, but it is ongoing, and it will be ongoing for an indefinite period of time.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I think not enough reflection has been made on the success of this coalition as a model, as both of you have mentioned, for other types of challenges we will face. And the world is growing increasingly complex, and the challenges are very great and full of hybrid threats. And this coalition is a really great example of working with partners, working with international partners, working with local partners, using hard power and soft power tools. And the other great thing about it is people come together to deal with a challenge, and then when that challenge changes, those countries can focus on other things. And that may be the way of the future, as opposed to focusing on our multilateral institutions that many people feel may have been designed for a different era. So really appreciate both of you spending time with us today to talk about incredible challenges. Really appreciate the work you're both doing out there in the field and diplomatically with all the capitals trying to hold it together. And hopefully we can welcome you to RUSI in person in the near future. So I'm going to ask all of our audience to virtually clap along with me, but thank you both.